Mile marker 21 on US Highway 212 is not one of the famous hairpins. It is not the switchback stack that photographers wait hours to shoot. And it is not the exposed shelf road above 10,000 feet where the guardrail simply stops. It is, by the description of the Wyoming Highway Patrol spokesman who spoke about it publicly, a soft curve in one of the most beautiful stretches of the Beartooth Highway, between the top of the World Store and Island Lake Campground. In late July of 2026, a motorcyclist died there. Investigators considered two explanations: a medical emergency or a moment of inattention. Nothing more dramatic than that. No hairpin, no black ice, no sheer drop. Just a gentle bend in the road, at elevation, in a place built to kill you slowly, in ways that rarely announce themselves in advance. That crash was the 7th motorcycle wreck of the year on this highway and its sister route, the Chief Joseph Scenic Byway, tying 2026 with 2004 for the worst year on record. All of them, every one happened in July. This is the story of the Beartooth Highway, the road the CBS correspondent Charles Kuralt once called the most beautiful drive in America, and the road that year after year keeps proving that beauty and danger are not opposites out here. They are the same terrain. The name itself comes from the mountains, not the road. Somewhere along the route, jagged rock spires rise from the ridgeline that early travelers thought looked like the exposed teeth of a bear. One of those spires, visible from the highway itself, gave the entire range, and eventually the road cut through it, its name. Locals and highway planners have called it other things over the decades too. The highway to the sky, a drive along the roof of the Rockies, the top of the world. Every one of those names is doing the same job. They are all trying to describe a road that spends 13 miles of its length above 10,000 feet, higher than almost anywhere else you can legally drive a passenger car in the United States. Before we climb any further, it's worth saying this plainly. If you've ever driven the Beartooth, or if you're watching this from Red Lodge, from Cook City, from Billings, or from somewhere thousands of miles away that has never seen a switchback in your life, I want to know. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and whether this is a road you have driven or one you're planning to. And if you want more of these deep dives into the roads America has built at the edge of what's survivable, subscribe now, because we go back out on the pavement every week. Now, back to the mountain. The Beartooth Highway is technically a 68-mile section of US Route 212 running between Red Lodge, Montana and Cook City, Montana, though for most of its length it isn't in Montana at all. It dips south, across the 45th parallel into Wyoming, tracing the state line for miles before crossing back north to reach Cook City and the northeast entrance of Yellowstone National Park. The road climbs from around 5,200 feet in the Rock Creek Valley to 10,147 feet at Beartooth Pass, a rise of roughly 5,500 feet accomplished in about 12 miles of switchbacks. That is more vertical gain than the drive up most of the tallest mountains in the continental United States, compressed into a strip of two-lane asphalt that in places is barely wide enough for two cars to pass each other. Along the way, the highway crosses through at least 3 distinct ecosystems: the forested valley floor near Red Lodge, dense subalpine forest as the switchbacks climb, and finally the treeless alpine tundra at the summit, a landscape more commonly associated with the Arctic than with a road you can drive in a rented sedan. Near its western end, the highway meets Wyoming Highway 296, the Chief Joseph Scenic Byway, before continuing on to Cook City and the boundary of Yellowstone itself. It is entirely possible and common to link the Beartooth and the Chief Joseph into a single loop, doubling the mileage of high-altitude switchbacks a driver takes on in a single day. Driven without stopping, the full crossing from Red Lodge to Cook City takes roughly 2 hours, though almost nobody actually drives it that way. 4 of the original bridges built during construction in the 1930s are still in daily use today. One spanning the outlet of Beartooth Lake, 2 crossing Little Bear Creek, and 1 over the outlet of Long Lake, each of them documented by federal historians as engineering artifacts in their own right, still carrying modern traffic across the same stone and steel laid down by crews working with hand tools nearly a century ago. The road exists because a Red Lodge physician named Dr. J.C.F. Siegfried spent years lobbying Congress to build it. He wanted a direct route connecting his coal mining town to Yellowstone, believing tourism could keep Red Lodge alive the way mining once had. Congress agreed in 1931, passing the National Parks Approach Roads Act, and that summer, construction crews began blasting a highway into a mountain range that early engineering surveys had already flagged as dangerously unsuited to it. They built it anyway. Hundreds of men, many of them out-of-work coal miners from Red Lodge, labored at elevations approaching 11,000 feet, using dynamite, hand tools, and machinery that would look primitive by any modern standard. The construction season up there lasts only a few months a year. The rest of the time, the mountain simply does not allow work to happen. The pay was 50 cents an hour, which, in the depths of the Great Depression, was described by one of the laborers decades later as a golden wage for a man who had come to the project broke. Most of the workforce was local, drawn from a region where the coal mines that had built Red Lodge were already failing. They worked with dynamite, hand tools, and construction equipment that would look almost antique today, cutting switchbacks directly into cliff faces above the Rock Creek Valley. It cost 2 of them their lives. Wino Timonen was killed when he was pulled into a rock crusher. Glenn Welch died in an accidental powder explosion, one of the countless detonations required to carve a road out of solid stone at nearly 2 miles above sea level. The road opened to limited traffic in 1935 and was formally dedicated on June 14, 1936, at a cost of roughly $2.5 million, completed for less than half of what the federal government had originally projected it would take. Visitors came from as far away as California and Maine to drive over what promoters were already calling the top of the world. By 1939, an average of 400 vehicles were making the crossing on a typical weekday. On weekends and holidays, that number climbed past 1,000, a volume of traffic the original engineers had almost certainly never imagined squeezing through a road this narrow at this altitude, with this little margin for error. What makes the Beartooth genuinely dangerous is not any single hairpin turn, though there are plenty of those. It is the combination of factors that stack on top of each other the higher you climb. The switchbacks near the summit gain elevation so quickly that your ears will pop repeatedly within a span of a few miles. Above roughly 9,500 feet, the highway breaks above the tree line entirely, and for a stretch of around 13 miles, it runs across open alpine tundra with nothing to block the wind, nothing to soften a whiteout, and in many sections, no guardrail between your tires and a drop of several hundred feet. Thin air at that altitude does not just make you lightheaded. It changes how an engine performs, how brakes behave on long descents, and how quickly fatigue and poor judgment can creep in without a driver noticing. Picture the climb itself. You leave Red Lodge in the valley, the road still wide and forgiving, pine forest pressing in on both sides. Within a few miles, the first switchback appears, and then another. and then a series of them stacked so tightly against the mountainside that you can look almost straight down at the pavement you drove 20 minutes earlier. Your speed drops to 15, sometimes 10 miles an hour on the tightest turns. The trees thin out, then disappear entirely. Above the tree line, the wind hits the car broadside, strong enough on bad days to push a lighter vehicle toward the center line. To your right, where a guardrail would normally sit, there is often nothing but a low rock berm, or nothing at all, just a shoulder that ends in several hundred feet of open mountainside beginning. The pass itself, when you finally reach it, levels into a wide, deceptively gentle plateau, dotted with small alpine lakes that look close enough to touch and are, in fact, a headache. Inducing distance below in reality, an illusion the thin air plays on your depth perception at that elevation. Then there is the weather, which behaves at Beartooth Pass the way weather behaves almost nowhere else most drivers have experienced. Because the highest reaches of the road sit above 10,000 feet on an exposed plateau, snow can fall in any month of the year. Snowdrifts at the summit routinely reach 20 to 26 feet deep by the end of winter, and clearing them each spring takes crews from the Montana Department of Transportation and the National Park Service weeks, sometimes months, of continuous plowing. The highway typically does not open for the season until sometime between May 22nd and June 1st. And it typically closes again between October 5 and October 15th, though typically is doing a lot of work in that sentence. In 2024, a snowstorm dumped 2 feet of fresh snow on the highway the day before its scheduled opening, delaying access by another week. The National Park Service has issued emergency closures in the middle of summer, including one in late September when 4 inches of snow and ice suddenly coated the roadway near the top. A driver who leaves Red Lodge in 70-degree sunshine can be navigating snow and ice at the summit less than an hour later, on a road with no shoulder and a several hundred-foot fall on one side. Engineers who have studied the mountainside in more recent decades during the highway's periodic reconstructions have described the terrain in blunt technical language: slopes exceeding 70 degrees, loose and highly unstable material, and gullies eroded as deep as 40 feet in places where water has been cutting through the rock for centuries. This is not a road built on a stable shelf of granite. It is a road built on a mountain that is still actively falling apart, one storm at a time, and the highway simply happens to be draped across it. This is the mountain that swallowed 2 of its own builders in the 1930s, and it has not stopped taking people since. In July of 2019, a motorcycle carrying a 70-year-old man and his 69-year-old passenger, both from Havre, Montana, was heading north on U.S. Highway 212 near the Montana-Wyoming state line. According to the Montana Highway Patrol, the rider missed a sharp left curve. The motorcycle left the roadway and went down into a dry creek bed, throwing both riders onto the rocks below. Both had been wearing helmets. The driver died. His passenger was airlifted to a hospital in Billings. It was, on paper, an ordinary summer weekend on the Beartooth. One curve, misjudged by a fraction of a second, was the only difference between a scenic ride and a fatality. 4 years later, in July of 2023, 56-year-old Eric Furman, who was from Nevada but working in the Helena area at the time, was riding his motorcycle north on U.S. Highway 212 south of Red Lodge. 2 other motorcycles were heading south toward him, each carrying a driver and a passenger. Near mile marker 47, according to the Montana Highway Patrol, Furman improperly negotiated a curve and struck both oncoming motorcycles. He was not wearing a helmet. He died while being transported for medical care. The 4 other riders were taken to a medical facility in Red Lodge. The severity of their injuries was not publicly released. Of the 6 people involved in that single collision, only 2 had been wearing helmets. 2 years after that, in the late summer of 2025, 50-year-old Matthew Wickel of Thane, Wyoming, was riding his 2002 Harley-Davidson West on U.S. Highway 212, about 5 miles south of the Montana border, near mile marker 70. It was raining. There was snow mixed into it. Wickel and his passenger, 58-year-old Don Patterson of Grand Blanc, Michigan, were making their way through the weather when, according to the Wyoming Highway Patrol, he lost control of the motorcycle. He crossed the center line, left the highway to the south, and crashed down a small hill. Neither he nor Patterson was wearing a helmet. Both were thrown from the motorcycle. Wickel was pronounced dead at the scene. Patterson was airlifted to a hospital in Billings. The crash happened at 2:50 in the afternoon in what should have been the middle of a summer riding season, on a road where summer and winter can occupy the same hour. Notice a pattern in the helmet detail because it isn't incidental. Both Montana and Wyoming have what are known as partial helmet laws. Riders under 18 are legally required to wear one, but adults are free to ride without. In 2 of the 3 crashes just described, the riders killed were not wearing helmets at the time of the collision, entirely within their legal right to make that choice. None of that is presented here to assign blame to the dead. It's presented because it's one more variable stacked onto a road that already asks a great deal of the people who drive it. Altitude, unpredictable weather, blind curves, minimal shoulders, and, for a large share of its annual traffic, riders on 2 wheels with nothing but the law's bare minimum standing between them and the pavement. And then, in July of 2026, the crash at mile marker 21 that opened this video. No hairpin, no black ice, just a soft curve in a beautiful stretch of road, a motorcyclist down an embankment, and a Wyoming Highway Patrol spokesman telling a reporter that this was already the road's 7th motorcycle crash of the year, tying the worst year on record. He offered a theory that should sit uncomfortably with anyone who has ever driven a road like this one for the thrill of it, that a lot of riders, in his words, are simply operating outside their own skill level. Add narrow curves, add altitude, add a posted speed limit that, on some of the lower straightaways approaching the mountain, reaches as high as 80 miles per hour before the road narrows and begins climbing into switchbacks that demand a fraction of that speed. Confidence built on a straightaway becomes a liability the moment the road turns vertical. If you're finding this as unsettling as I do, that is the point, and it's exactly why this channel exists. To take roads most people only see in a highlight reel and show you the mechanics of what actually makes them dangerous. If that is useful to you, the subscribe button is right there, and it costs nothing. Now, let's talk about what happens when the mountain itself decides to fight back against the road that was built on top of it. Because the Beartooth Highway's danger is not limited to curves and motorcycles. The road has been physically destroyed by the land it sits on more than once, within living memory. In May of 2005, a series of mudslides and rock slides tore through the Montana side of the highway on May 19th and 20, damaging or outright destroying the roadway in a dozen separate locations between mile markers 39 and 51. The damage was concentrated in the switchback section near the top of the climb, one of the most structurally difficult stretches to rebuild anywhere in the American highway system. The state issued a $20.4 million construction contract with an October 2005 completion deadline. Crews finished the physical construction ahead of schedule. The highway still did not reopen for a full year because engineers needed that time to stabilize the ground beneath it. In total, roughly 100,000 cubic yards of unstable rock were removed from a half-mile stretch of mountainside so that the road above it would not simply slide away again. 17 years later, in June of 2022, it happened again, and worse. Historic flooding struck the Yellowstone region after rain fell directly onto a deep mountain snowpack, triggering catastrophic runoff across the entire area. The Beartooth Highway washed out in at least 6 separate locations, leaving scours in the roadbed up to 100 feet long. Rock Creek, which the highway follows for much of its lower elevation routes, tore through sections of pavement entirely. The damage was part of a broader flood disaster that led President Biden to sign a national emergency declaration for the state. Total repair costs for the highway were eventually estimated at more than $22 million. Montana's Transportation Department made the decision to relocate entire sections of the 2-lane road up to 80 feet away from the creek itself, in hopes that distance alone would prevent the next flood from doing the same thing again. That reconstruction work was still ongoing years later, with additional excavation and slope work continuing into 2025, drawing concern from conservation groups worried about erosion into what had, until then, been a healthy trout fishery. For the towns on either end of the highway, none of this is an abstract engineering problem. Red Lodge depends on Beartooth traffic the way it once depended on coal. When the road is closed, whether by a June blizzard or a 100-foot washout, the shops, motels, and outfitters that line its main street lose the visitors who would otherwise be passing through on their way to Yellowstone. The 2022 flooding didn't just take out sections of asphalt, it cut off access to popular trailheads along the main fork of Rock Creek and forced the closure of multiple campgrounds for the remainder of that season. Damage that a subsequent estimate placed at roughly $20 million just within the surrounding national forest, separate from the highway repairs themselves. This is a road, in other words, that has needed to be partially rebuilt after almost every serious storm season, on a mountainside so steep in places that the terrain exceeds 70 degrees of slope, in conditions that combine unstable rock, deep gullies, and a climate that can swing from flood to blizzard within the same calendar year. It is a road that DOT engineers have described as complicated by hydrologic, geologic, and climatic conditions all at once, which is a technical way of saying that almost nothing about the ground beneath it can be trusted to stay still. What ties all of this together? The motorcycle crashes and the mudslides, and the 2 men who died building the thing in the first place, is a single, uncomfortable truth about the Beartooth Highway. It does not look as dangerous as it is. It is consistently ranked among the most scenic drives in the country, with thousands of alpine lakes visible from points along the route and more than 20 peaks over 12,000 feet framing the horizon in every direction. It was designated an all-American road by the U.S. Department of Transportation in June of 2000, one of the highest honors a scenic byway in this country can receive, a status shared by only a small handful of roads nationwide and reserved for routes considered destinations unto themselves, not merely ways of getting somewhere else. None of that beauty is false advertising, but it is also, functionally, camouflage. A road this stunning invites drivers and riders to relax exactly where the terrain demands the opposite. And the Wyoming Highway Patrol has said, in plain terms, that many of the crashes they investigate on the Beartooth and its neighboring Chief Joseph Highway happen on curves that are not even the sharpest ones on the map, because riders let their guard down between the dramatic switchbacks on stretches that look, and mostly are, gentler. Today, the highway is open, rebuilt, and busier than ever, especially in the weeks surrounding the annual Sturgis Motorcycle Rally in South Dakota, one of the largest motorcycle gatherings in the world, when thousands of riders detour through Wyoming and Montana specifically to cross the Beartooth and the Chief Joseph Scenic Byway before continuing east toward the rally. Wyoming Highway Patrol officials have said publicly that they do not necessarily expect a spike in serious crashes during Sturgis Week itself, but the sheer volume of unfamiliar riders passing through, many of them on rented or borrowed machines, on a road with a reputation but no personal history with any of them, adds another layer of risk to an already difficult stretch of asphalt. It remains a seasonal road, closing every winter under snowdrifts that can bury a car whole, and reopening every late spring after weeks of plowing by crews who sometimes have to start over after a single fresh storm buries their progress overnight. It is jointly maintained by the Montana Department of Transportation, the Wyoming Department of Transportation, and the National Park Service, an arrangement so bureaucratically split across the middle of the pass that one agency's stretch of road can be open while another agency's stretch, a few miles further on, remains closed to traffic. The Federal Highway Administration has itself described the Beartooth's ownership and maintenance history as troubled, the product of a historic roadway that, despite its renown, went years without a single agency fully responsible for keeping it in good repair. That divided responsibility is not just a bureaucratic curiosity. It means that a hazard identified on one side of an invisible jurisdictional line can take longer to fix than the same hazard would on the other side. On a road where the terrain does not recognize state boundaries, even when the paperwork does. The Beartooth Basin's summer ski area, sitting at roughly 10,900 feet near the pass, remains the only ski area in North America that operates exclusively in the summer, open only during the narrow window when the road itself is passable and the snowpack, ironically, is still deep enough to ski on. Mile marker 21 is still there. So is every other mile marker on this highway, each one a coordinate on a road that has been called, without much exaggeration in either direction, both the most beautiful drive in America and one of its most unforgiving. The switchbacks are still there, climbing toward a summit that can be sunny and mild in the valley below and snowing sideways at the top, sometimes within the same afternoon. The guardrails are still missing in the places where they have always been missing, and somewhere on this road, this summer or the next, someone will misjudge a soft curve in perfect weather, going the speed they have gone 100 times before on a stretch that has never once looked like the kind of place where anything goes wrong. None of this means the Beartooth Highway should be avoided. Hundreds of thousands of people drive it safely every year, and the overwhelming majority of them reach Cook City or Red Lodge with nothing more than a full memory card and a story about the view. But the statistics are the statistics. A road built by hand, at the cost of 2 lives, reshaped by floods twice in the last 20 years at a combined cost approaching $45 million. And in the summer of 2026 alone, the site of 7 separate motorcycle wrecks by the end of July, on curves that more often than not were not even the sharpest ones on the map. Charles Kuralt was not wrong when he called this the most beautiful drive in America nearly 50 years ago. He simply never mentioned the other half of the sentence, the half every highway patrol trooper who has worked this stretch could finish for him without hesitation. If you drive the Beartooth, slow down before you think you need to, not after. The road will not warn you twice. Tell me in the comments if you have driven it, or if this is the first you are hearing of it, and I will see you on the next one.